to West Coast of the United States and Canada. Good evening to those of you in Europe, and a good late evening to those of you in the Middle East, and of course my friends throughout the great continent of Africa. I miss all of you, and really cherish and appreciate the constant contact. For those of you, especially in 6 countries in Southern Africa, from our time together, it means a lot to me to get good morning, good evening messages. So I want to do a little shout out for that. And I often tell my network that I haven't been to Zambia specifically, or any Southern Africa country, for more than a decade. And so for me to receive messages just wishing me a great day from many of you that worked on the team back in those days with Barclays, I really appreciate that. As a leader, that is really the greatest reward I think that somebody could ever ask for, is to just be remembered and be wished a great day by people. So thank you all for that. For those of you in Asia, I know you're sleeping, but I know there'll be about 2,000 of you that see this, see this conversation over the weekend. So please feel free, even though you're not live, to engage over the weekend on the replay. For those of you that are tuning in live, please make sure you say hello to my guest and I, and let us know where you're tuning in from. I'll make sure we give you a shout out. And most importantly, this program is really for you. It's not for my special guest and myself. It's for you. And we're going to today to arm you up with 2 tools to help you, whether you're an individual contributor or a leader. And so as a result of that, any question is fair game. And so please do tee up, and this is an opportunity for you to engage with it. I hope that all of you are limiting your media consumption, and that this will become your main media consumption for the day. So make the most of it by engaging with us and asking questions as well. We already have Jasmine here, who I know is tuning in from Sweden. So thank you, Jasmine. Great to have you on board. My special guest today, who I'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll get into the conversation. Is coming to us live from San Francisco, California. Her name is Sejal Thakkar. Sejal is a very special guest, and I'll talk about how we met in a few minutes. But she's on a mission to educate and empower people, and to create a world where everybody is treated with dignity and respect. And when I heard about this mission a couple of years ago, I just said I have to be forceful if necessary, and get her ear and meet her and join forces with her to help her with her movement. And boy, am I glad I did that. She was very open, and I didn't have to force anything through. And when I say forceful, I mean to do whatever's necessary to meet this woman. I was ready to do that when I heard about her mission. And she was very welcoming. And we've built an amazing, trusted relationship since then. And it's one of the best decisions that I've made with meeting somebody that I just saw on a digital platform. Sejal is a former employment law attorney, a 2 times TEDx speaker, and founder and chief civility officer at TrainXtra. We'll talk about what TrainXtra does in a few minutes. It's basically a woman minority-owned training consulting firm where she helps leaders create safe, respectful workplaces. I think my network clearly understands how I feel about the root cause of the Great Resignation. It's not the pandemic. It is at the very root of what has caused so many people to leave their workplaces. That a lot of them don't feel safe, they don't feel respected, and they don't necessarily feel that they are working for an inclusive organization. We'll talk about what that means, and Sejal will share what she shared in her her second talk was really inspiring to me because she talked about also coming at it from the angle of exclusion. Okay, so it's a very unique way to look at something, but the mission for sustained profits over the long term is to build an inclusive culture, not where you tick boxes or human resources is driving it, but it's where people actually feel their voice is heard, and it's everybody feeling that their voice is heard. Then you have a very inclusive type of environment. They determine the criteria, not the bosses of the organization or HR. It's really how people feel. And we'll get into a bit of that as well. Sage was also the chief culture officer at Nobody Studios, which is it's very unique. It's a venture capital firm that is aiming to create 100 companies in 5 years, which is amazing. And they're well off and running on this mission. We'll talk a bit about Nobody throughout the program and at the end of it as well. So really happy, Sejal, to have you here. I'm going to grab a sip of water and welcome you to the program.
Thank you so much, Brett, for that warm welcome. I just want to apologize to you and everybody else that I have my video camera off today. I have a weird sort of allergic reaction happening on my lips. And so believe me, everybody is probably happy that I have my camera off right now. It doesn't look that flattering right now. But so thank you again. I apologize for that, but I know that we're going to have a fantastic conversation. I am such a huge fan of your leadership, Brett. As you know, I try to really absorb and learn from all of the wonderful content you put out on LinkedIn. And you're the kind of leader that I, want to align myself with, because this is not a one-person job. You and I are going to talk about how this requires all hands on deck to really create these cultures of inclusion and belonging in the way that we can. And I believe that we're at a very important, critical point right now. And so I'm really looking forward to digging into these two topics that we've sort of preliminarily agreed to, because I think that if people really get this information that I'm going to share with them, some really practical tips that they can start applying and helping us move the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, very, very well. And Sejal, again, thanks for coming on here. So everybody, you have the pleasure or displeasure of looking at me the entire time. And so anyway, I put on a suit and tie for you, as I always do. So, but Sejal will be doing most of the talking here, but I'll be right here with you. Please, again, do tee up and engage with us as well. I'd like to welcome Paul Gunn here, who has joined us. Paul, welcome to the program. Great to have you here. For those of you that are not following Paul Gunn, you must do that, because you will become inspired on a daily basis. And it doesn't take more than a minute of what he has to dish out every day. So thank you, Paul, for that. We have like to welcome Sushma. Sushma Verma is here as well. So Sejal, I believe you know Sushma. We have Amelia Hogan, who's tuning in from San Francisco, the Bay Area, one of my favorite cities. That's where Sejal is as well. I'm coming to you today from Las Vegas, just so everybody knows. So we're both on the West Coast. We have somebody from LinkedIn. Glad to be here. Important conversation. It certainly is. And we're about to get right into it as well. So, Paul, we respect you as well. So I'll come back to the chats throughout the conversation. But with that as a backdrop in the introduction, Sejal, let's kind of get into a little bit about your story. That maybe you could start, if you're okay, just giving us 2-3 minute recap of how your journey started in, I'm going from memory here, I don't have notes on this, but how you started, you and your family, Indian family, in Chicago, and you were growing up in Chicago. And I think it's important, for reasons that will become obvious, that we kind of start with your time in Chicago as a backdrop.
Thank you, Brett. Yeah, absolutely. I was born and raised in Chicago. My parents are immigrants from India, so they moved to Illinois in 1974. And so, I grew up in a predominantly Italian neighborhood.
Mm.
We were the only Indian family there. And, I think it was made pretty clear that we were not welcome there from the outset. We looked different. We acted different. My parents had accents. They owned a convenience store. So, it was really kind of, I think the experiences that I had in my childhood of being on the receiving end of harassment, of bullying, of discrimination, really kind of shaped the trajectory of my career, right? Because as being a victim of that, of bias, I knew that I wanted to make a difference, and I wanted to do something to help systemically change the way that our systems were set up. And so law school became a normal sort of thing in my. I wanted to be a social justice advocate. I'm going to do what I can. And so I knew early on that I was going to go to law school. I mean, my dad would joke around about the fact that I asked way too many questions and I asked why all the time. I still do that, Brett. I mean, even this morning, I typed an email, in our Slack channel to our leadership team saying, I prepared this document with the why. And they're all like, yeah, we're seasoned leaders. And I'm like, I know, but this is just how my brain operates.
Right.
I like to
Yeah.
get the why down first, right? So
Absolutely.
law school. So law school became my it was a plan. And I got to law school, and then the interesting, I would say my sort of discoveries of, do I really want to do this now, started, right? So I started as an attorney, as a defense attorney, like you said, and I was actually representing leaders in cases that dealt with harassment and discrimination. So that's kind of a twist, right? Because you just heard my story of being a victim of that. You would have, most people, when they hear my story, they're like, Sejal, you should be defending the victims. Why are you defending?
You're on the other side. Yeah.
I'm on the other side, and so, but that really gave me a look at these cases from a different perspective. And then I realized that, being a lawyer was something that I've always wanted to do. And I'm grateful for the skills that I had, but I realized that I was more of a conflict resolution person rather than a litigator, and really wanted to educate people so that we don't end up in those situations in the first place. Right. So we could talk a little bit more about how I did the career pivot and, how it took a lot of courage for me to do those things as we get into this conversation.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's an important point, because a lot of the work you do now is rooted in your experience back in Chicago in those days. And as we all know, that our roots are really formed. Oftentimes, it can change based on events, but oftentimes based on our childhood. And I know your second TEDx talk, you gave an example of something that your son recently went through. So maybe we can kind of get into that. So these situations and circumstances that we go through as children can be quite formative in our life. So I think that that's really important, and I admire you for doing what you do now to help people.
Thank you, Brett. And I'll just add another layer, right? So you're absolutely right. Our experiences and what we've been exposed to definitely impact our beliefs, our current beliefs, our actions, interactions with other people. And so the other part of my childhood that I want to highlight here, and this is what the two different TEDx talks that I've done really highlight two different sort of identities or parts of my childhood, or the experiences that I went through. One, talking about what I just explained about being a victim of harassment, discrimination, and how that sort of shaped my views. But the other part, which is what I talk about in the second talk, is my duality between the two cultures of the American culture and the Indian culture. And really sort of, at home, being raised as traditionally Indian, and then coming out of your house and dealing with a completely different culture, different expectations, and really how that sort of marginality between the two cultures has also shaped a lot of why I hold the views that I do and why I educate and empower in the way that I do.
Right. And I think it's important for people to understand that, that when we talk about much of what we're going to talk about, it's not limited to skin color, to gender. It's not limited to, it's not a limiting type of thing. And it also gets into what I spoke about in the opening around how people feel, right? And do they feel their voice is heard, for example? So it's not something shallow and cheap on the surface, like skin color only. That can be a driver of behavior. Certainly, I understand that, especially in the society that all humans live in today, and also in the past, right, for decades. But it's deeper than that, and it's deeper. And you're raising a point around culture, and that the Indian culture is quite different than the American culture, and the Chicago culture is very different than the San Francisco or the Las Vegas culture, right? So these are things that I can tell you, having lived and worked pretty much around the world on every major continent except for uh, South America, that every culture is different. If you go to Asia and you meet somebody for the first time and slap your business card down on the table like you do in America, you might as well walk out of the room, because you have just disrespected everybody that you're meeting, because the
Mm.
business card in Asia is cherished, right? And if you go to lunch in Japan with somebody and you put your chopsticks in your rice unintentionally, you have just signaled to them death. So
Mm.
these things are very important. I'm glad you brought up the cultural, because there's so much to this that we as humans, in dealing, especially in a global world, there's so many things that we need to become aware of when we're engaging with other people, because we might do something that may appear to be quite normal, to us, because maybe our experiences are limited, but it can be perceived quite differently by somebody else. Maybe the difference between the gold and the platinum rule, Sejal. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know that you're speaking my language right now,
Yeah,
and this is why we connect so deeply.
right.
And because we're all different from each other, and that's really the point. Is that I try to hammer home when I'm working with clients and when I'm talking with leaders, is that when you're leading a team of people, you're leading every single person on that team who is different from everybody else. So those days of when leaders were like, it's my way or the highway, here's my leadership style, and everybody needs to comport to conform to my leadership style, those days are long gone. I mean,
Right.
now a leader, to be successful and thrive, has to be able to recognize the differences in his team, in his or her teams, to celebrate those and to create an environment where people can express their identities and be open about it. Because here's the thing that I realized, the biggest lesson out of doing those two TEDx talks really
Mm.
was that lots of people have gone through similar things. And that really was the purpose, is that we just taught not to talk about it. Some of the things that you and I are going to be talking about today, we have been told our whole lives, to, at least I have, in the Indian culture, the Asian
Mhm.
culture, keep your head down. Don't speak up. Just do your work and get by, and you'll get promoted and you'll make the money. And we just want to slide by. We don't want to get noticed, right?
Right. Mhm.
And so when you come with that sort of preconditioning into a work environment and things are going wrong, you're not going to say anything, which is a big mistake, because we want to encourage people to say something so that we can fix those problems, so that we don't end up in court, right? And so this is just one example of the kinds of things that I was seeing that leaders were doing or
Mm.
not doing, that were simple fixes, in my opinion, that I'm like,
Yeah.
well, we just need to go back and I don't mean this, when I say simple, I'm not saying that it's easy,
Mhm.
right? I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, it's going to require a lot of the practices I'm going to share are going to require time and energy. So in that way, but they're well worth it, because at the end of the day, even if all you care about is the bottom line,
Right.
which sadly is most leaders, then these things matter,
They matter a
right? They
lot, and
directly. Yeah.
absolutely, they matter a lot. And the fact that I kind of teased in the advertisement of this program the fact that we're going to teach those of you that are listening to us right now. We're going to provide some unique lessons that you're not going to get elsewhere. I'm confident when I say that. Some unique lessons around how to be a better leader, and as a result of that, how to generate higher sustainable profits. And we'll get into specific, we're going to give you a specific solution to that. But Sejal, you just touched on a big part of that. I just wanted to just briefly acknowledge Heather McWilliam, who is Heather. For some reason, your name's not showing. It's saying LinkedIn user, but I went over and looked at it. So thank you, Heather. Heather's coming in from Toronto, Canada, as well. I know her. She has her own story, and she's on a mission to help humanity as well. So I know this will resonate well with you, Heather, as well. Please follow Heather as well. Like to welcome Aloysius Segawa as well. Not sure where you're from, Aloysius. Please let us know. I'll put it on the screen. And Sushma, speaking up is not only discouraged, but it's met with pushback and backfiring situations when done. It is, and I don't know, Sejal, you want to respond to that comment?
Yeah, no, I know Shushman, and I know that, coming from an Indian household and other, other Asian households, that this is something that's drilled, literally drilled into our heads. Because if you think about when our parents came here, they barely spoke English. They didn't have most of the immigrants that came in, they didn't have a lot of money, and they were literally put to work the next day.
Mm-hmm.
So their ability to provide for their family is dependent on them having jobs. And the last thing they were going to do is say or do anything that was going to risk that job, which was the only way they were going to survive. So there was a lot of fear for these folks to not speak up, even if they were dealt with some toxic work environments and horrible situations. I mean,
Yeah.
when you look at some of these cases and you're like, why would somebody put up with that? Why would they put up with that? Well, the question really is, yes, why did they? And if you go back and you put yourself in that person's shoes to figure out what they were going through at that time, it makes sense. It may not make sense for us right now to say nobody should put themselves, but even right now, people are dealing with toxic work environments. That's why we have so many lawsuits being filed every day. And retaliation, going to Shushma's point, retaliation is still the number one complaint being filed across the states, right? Because there is a legitimate, actual fear that people have that if they speak up, that they're going to be fired, they're going to be suspended, they're going to suffer retaliation, whether it's overt retaliation or subtle. Let's not forget the subtle retaliations. There's so many cases that involve subtle retaliation that don't even make it to the courthouse, right? That don't even
Right.
that we don't even have the numbers on yet.
And they're driven unconsciously, which we'll get into. And I'm glad you brought that up, Sejal. It wasn't on our plate, and I knew this conversation would kind of go in some different directions. So to those of you tuning in, we will get to the courage piece in a few minutes, as well as the unconscious bias piece. But I think the retaliation that's a really important point that you're making. I'm also aware of some major cases in the UK. So you mentioned across the states, and I can tell you that I'm aware of some cases in the UK, rather recently, by the way, where the retaliation is in play through the whistleblower policy, where leadership has abused their own policy around protecting whistleblowers, right? And this isn't right. So one of the things that I want people to get out of this, especially leaders, whistleblowing is a way that you can ensure an inclusive, safe environment and ecosystem. Okay, without a whistleblowing procedure, an avenue where employees can go, okay, if they sense something wrong, okay, part of that whistleblowing policy involves investigations, and they can be either upheld or accepted, but you've got to investigate it, right? But the point is, this retaliation, you've got to take that out. It's kind of like putting salt in a freshwater fish tank. Okay, if you abuse your own policy, it's your tank. Okay, you've got some freshwater fish swimming around, and you convert the water to salt water. When you do that, you're just destroying your own fish. They are not going to survive. Sejal, anything you'd like to add on to whistleblowing?
I love this, and I honestly think that could be a separate topic that
Yeah,
we can talk about on a different day, because I really think that leaders don't understand the nuances of subtle retaliation, because I see it happening all the time.
right.
And I think it'd be great to really explore that. And then also, I think it's important to on the topic of speaking up, right? There's a difference between calling somebody out and calling somebody in, right? So how we speak
Mhm.
up is obviously another area that I really am focused in on, because
Yep.
over and over again in my career, when I would go back and investigate these cases, and that's another, that retaliation and investigation should be a show of its own,
Right.
Brett, that we could do
Yeah.
together if you're interested,
Let's do
because
that. Yeah. Why don't we? Yeah.
investigations have changed significantly now that people are working virtually, and there are different implications and things that leaders need to be aware of,
Right.
and how they're handling these complaints and investigations. So anyway, I'll end with this, because I can go off on that topic for another
Right.
hour.
Yep.
But I'll just say one last thing on what you said. Investigations are critical, and leaders, it's not only important to investigate those issues that rise to the level of whistleblowing, meaning that they're legally protected activities, but it's also important to investigate and take seriously the concerns that don't match up to your legal definitions. Like, for example, abusive conduct. You have an employee that comes to you and says, I'm being bullied by somebody. Well, technically, under California law and under most of the state laws, bullying in and of itself is not a legally protected activity under the law that you can file a lawsuit for. So a lot of leaders, what I see them doing is not really addressing that situation, not investigating, and then forget switching out the salt water. Right now, the fish themselves are being harmed,
Yeah.
right, because
Hmm.
of not just the water, but the entire environment. The whole fish tank itself
Yeah. It's
is
toxic.
now
Yep.
contaminated, right? Yep.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, Sejal. And so let's close down this part of the conversation. Again, feel free to ask us questions on this topic as well. Tee them up and we'll answer them. But what I'd like to close this section out. This wasn't a design section, so we'll do another live on this topic. But folks, if you're a leader, go on offense, not defense. And I found this useful throughout my entire career, where it was open door, open books. And what would happen is, if you're on offense, that means that you make these things available. And you'll find that if you build things like whistleblowing, um, why retaliation isn't necessary in a healthy ecosystem. If you build that healthy ecosystem, which is what leaders should be focused on, not just managing compliance processes, because then you get into defense mode, and then you're in court, and then you're constantly defending what your managers that are probably bad managers, and the whole thing. That's a losing game, and that's unprofitable. That dilutes your profits. Whereas if you're on offense and you build a healthy ecosystem, you build a robust um, whistleblowing process, you'll find that when you have that ecosystem, that whistleblowing process will rarely get used. It in a way, it's very much like having a nuclear arsenal. Let's keep our fingers crossed it will never get used, right? It's there, okay, but it will never get used. And the whistleblowing process, if you build the right ecosystem, will never get used. But if necessary, it will be used, and it's there, and it'll be used properly. So please focus on the ecosystem. And there's a lot of professional help that can help you design these ecosystems where you can do it properly. And you'll find, guess what? You're not in court. You're not having to defend things. You're able to focus on your customers because your employees are with you. Your engagement is at a very high, it's above HPO, high performing organization. And you just don't have to worry about these things because there's nothing to defend. You don't need to defend your turf. Okay, good. Sejal, thank you. I think we kind of beat that one, beat that drum pretty hard here as well. I want to, Sejal, kind of get into the courage part, because we promised in the lead up to this session that we would give some tips on courage. And I thought your story is pretty amazing. So here you are. You go to law school. You're practicing as a very successful attorney, a corporate attorney as well. And you've already explained why you made the switch. But I would imagine that took some courage, right? To go from a corporate environment, decent paying, compensation wise, benefits wise, a whole bunch of advantages. I mean, I only worked for corporations in my life, so there are clear advantages to doing that as well. And then you take the leap into doing what you're doing now. And on the first day, you don't have any clients, right? You don't, so that had to feel a little bit scary, risky, I would imagine. Talk to us about how you actually built the courage to pursue your purpose and to take those risks so that you can do what you're doing now.
Yeah, and it was definitely it was very scary,
Mhm.
because my parents, as I mentioned, they owned their own businesses my whole life growing up. So I grew up in convenience stores, right? So I knew how to use the cash register before anything else, right? So
Mhm.
I grew up with that in my household, and I saw that when because my parents were so busy with their own businesses, they weren't at home, and so it left me with this feeling of I don't want to own my own business because that means I'm away from my family and I don't want to be away from my family. So owning my own business was something I never really had a plan or desire to do. But as
Mhm.
I mentioned earlier, as I was doing the litigation work, very early on, I realized that there was a misalignment,
Mm.
in that, yes, I'm a rock star litigator. I won cases. I loved being in the courtroom, arguing cases. I was really good at it, but it wasn't very aligned with what I wanted to do, which was to help resolve these cases. So for example, if I was working on a case where somebody had been harassed, I wanted to be, I wanted that person to be compensated. I wanted to fix that situation rather than litigate it for years on end and put this person through more harm, right?
Mhm.
So, and nobody really wins in those situations anyway. Maybe the lawyer does, right? Who's getting paid by the billable
Right.
hour, but besides that, nobody else really did, right? So I wanted to work with organizations proactively, and so what ended up happening was as I continued to do this work, the other thing that sort of came around. And so I'm giving you this background because a lot of times when we're making these very important decisions,
Mhm.
it feels like I'm making this decision right now. But this history is important because I'd already been sort of working towards this decision before actually taking that leap of faith, right? So I also saw something else happening in that I said, what are the skills and talents I have accumulated by being an attorney, and how can I use those in actually proactively helping organizations? So I started this process, and that's where it became really clear that I had a passion for educating and coaching and lead and working with leaders to proactively create better workplaces. So then it happened. I had a birthday, right? I had a birthday in November in 2017, and I was working for an organization at the time, and I really wasn't happy working there. The environment wasn't the type of environment that was going to help me thrive. And I sat down and I had this conversation where it's like, what, you know, am I going to believe in myself, in my passion, in these skills, in this vision that I want, this mission to make a better, to help create better workplaces? What are the things that are blocking me, right? And the things that jumped out at me was there was a lot of uncertainty. I'm a single mother. I am the sole provider for my family,
Mhm.
and I've gotten used to at this point having a steady paycheck every week, right, or every
Right.
2 weeks.
Right.
And now this uncertainty of what happens if I have a few bad months and I don't have any business? How am I going to pay the bills? Who's going to support my family? So there was a lot of uncertainty and fear around that I had to work through. And then there was a lot of like fear of failure. Am I going to succeed at this? I've never done anything like this before. I don't have any clients. I don't
Right.
have
Right. Starting
the
with
clients
zero.
lined up.
Right.
I'm starting at ground zero. I'm afraid of rejection. I'm afraid of disappointment in myself. Am I going to succeed? Everyone is, I'm supposed to be going down this trajectory of being a litigation. So there was a lot of things that I
Mm.
had to consider and I thought about. But what it came down to me is that in order for me to overcome these fears, I was going to have to face them, right? I was going to have to believe in myself. I was going to have to believe in the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really embrace that fear. Embrace that fear, which is kind of going to sound scary to people that are listening, and they're going to be thinking like, what does she
Right.
mean? Embrace that fear.
Right.
And what I mean is that when, for me, and I speak from my own experiences, right? That whenever I get fearful, and I think about why am I fearful right now, what I realize is that it's a natural response to situations that I'm not comfortable with. Whether,
Mm-hmm.
it's, I've never done this. What it signals to me, and I've gotten really good at picking up on it now, is that, Sejal, you are stepping outside of your comfort zone right now. And that's why you're having this fear. And so the question of courage really comes down to, am I going to confront this fear of the uncertainty or the unknown, whatever is going to come, in order to, with bravery, right? Am I going to confront this so that I can come out on the other side to grow, to develop into a better version of myself, right? So I always think about, that's where the magic happens, Brett, is when you're in those situations where you're like, do I take this leap of faith or do I not? And is it scary? Yes, it's very scary, but you have to take that courage and believe in yourself to see. And if I don't make it, guess what? That law degree's got to be worth something that it's printed on, right? So I can always
Mm-hmm.
go back to it if I decide if this wasn't what I wanted to do. But you really have to be brave in these situations, and surrounding myself with people like you, with other people that are like-minded, that really were there to support me, to encourage me, was a critical component
Yep.
in me taking that leap of faith, right? Because I knew that this was, a lot of times we think we can do all these things on our own,
Yeah.
but we have to accept that some things are just bigger than us and that we need to rely on one another to do it.
I think you're right, and I think that and they can be the little soft things, right? They can be the little pep talk when you get hit in the side of the head with something, and there's a big disappointment. But yeah, I think that's wonderful advice, and I found it useful to also say that ask yourself, what is the worst thing that can happen? And to actually go back in your life when you were facing some of these risks and to say, what is the worst thing that did happen? Rarely does it match what you initially thought it would be. So, the hole may not be as deep as what you fear it is. Okay. And that's usually the case. And another tip that I'll give is to, look, imagine yourself 5, 10 years from now. If you take a risk, you fail at it. In 5 or 10 years, is that going to be the end of you? Is that going to be so devastating that it wipes you out? No, it's not going to be, right? So try to, ask those two questions to keep things in perspective. And then you might have more of an aptitude to take the risk.
Yeah, and Brett, I'll just add to what you
Hmm.
just said. Like that's a practice. That's a really, I just want to highlight that practice that you said, because
Yeah.
it gets lost in a lot of these conversations. Is what we're talking about is here is when you get into those positions, right, where you're fearful and you know that you're fearful of something,
Yep.
something that you're unfamiliar with, something that just happened, you have no control over, and
Yep.
now there's that fear. It's the practice there is to shift your mindset to curiosity, right?
Hmm.
So, like for example, when I went through my housing crisis last year, I was put in a situation without any control over something that I'd never gone through in my life, and I was given a time frame where I had to figure out a place to live for my son and I. We had to find a home within 60 days. I was so scared,
Hmm.
but I shifted my mindset into, I don't know anything about this whole situation, but I'm going to be curious. I'm going to keep asking questions, and whenever I get hit with that no, which we would say is failure, which isn't failure, it's part of the process.
Right.
But every time I get that no, which feels really really bad, is to say, why? How can I get around this? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so this isn't working. Why isn't it working? And what do I need to do to get around this obstacle? So just start asking those questions of why. And as we know, Brett, and I forget the name of the person, you know this, the five whys, right? That get you to the root
Right.
cause.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that enough times, you realize that what seems like a failure is really just a hurdle that you need to get around. And you
Right.
can get around it or go under it, go over it, go to the side of it, but you got to be curious. If you just accept that, then it does become that's where you're going to stop. If you just say, this is all I can get to. And I remember you and I had this conversation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you were telling me, you're like, Sejal, the economy is bad right now, the interest rates. And my response was, I know, but I'm going to figure out how to get around it. I'm going to figure this out. And I just kept going with that why. And then over time, as you do that, you develop that resilience, that
Right.
persistence, perseverance of, okay, I may not get exactly what I want, but I'm going to try to get as close to it as I can. And it may not look like the end goal, but that's okay. I'm closer to it there than I am right now. And that's where the journey is, right? That's where if you can see that as long as you continue to make that progress, it's not failure. It's in my
Right.
book, it's success, right?
Yeah, and that you're exactly right, and I'd encourage everybody to also think about don't accept failure. There's a lot of chatter nowadays about failures, learning. It's a great teacher. It is okay, but you don't want to go through life as a full-time student. Okay, if you're only learning, so your mindset needs to be. And you were this way with your housing crisis. Your mindset was, I'm not going to take no for an answer. I'm going to find a place to live. So you weren't willing to accept failure along the way. So you applied the curiosity, the five whys that you mentioned as well. But Sejal, I know for a fact that you weren't going to accept failure and just crawl into a little hole and say I give up. And as a result of that, your mindset pulled you forward towards that goal. So don't let these people, for the audience here, don't let these people tell you that it's okay to fail. It's okay to fail, and to have that. There's a little bit more to it than that. It's okay to fail. Okay, don't be afraid or fumble. I think you use that a lot, Sejal. It's okay to fumble,
Yeah.
but
Humble. Yeah.
don't expect it, because then it might become a habit. And if it becomes a habit and you begin to expect that you're going to fail all the time, that's not a good habit to have. And what will happen is that your mind will respond to that. Well, I'm supposed to fail. So so I think that it's a little bit of an art, not a science.
It
Sejal has pointed
is.
out, her ways of doing it this way: to be curious, to ask the whys. I've added a little bit in that, it's probably never as risky as what you might initially think, but don't expect to fail, because then you become a full-time student and you won't get that house. You won't make that career switch. So have that expectation that you're going to cross that finish line and you're going to get it. And if you fall down, if you fumble, it's okay, but get back up and do it again. But don't keep repeating the same problems, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And what I think it comes down to is the bottom line is failure is part of the journey. It's going to happen,
Right.
right? It's going to happen to all of us.
Yeah.
It's the point is are we learning from these failures? Are
Mhm.
we learning from them? Are we adapting and are we keeping to move forward, right? And at the end of the day, like when I think back to that situation, which still makes my hair stand every time I think about it, it's about taking calculated
Right.
risks,
It is.
right? We have
Mhm.
to take some risks and we have to take some calculated risks. It's not to say blindfolded, you go jump off the bridge, right? That's
Mhm.
not what we're saying. But I had to take some calculated risks in
Right.
that situation. And so like following our dreams, right? Which is where we all started this conversation off is how do we follow our dreams? Me wanting to find a career that was more fulfilling for me, chasing after our dreams, buying a home, starting a new career, whatever that
Right.
is going to involve some level of risk. There's no way to get
You
around
can't get
that.
around it.
And
Yep.
You can't get around it, but it's a matter of taking calculated risk. And here's what I want to say is because there's a lot of people giving a lot of advices, and you see a lot of people talking about what we should be doing. Everybody's situations are different.
Right.
And so we have to take a look at what are all these different factors that are going on in my life. What are the opportunities? What are the expectations I'm dealing with? What are my limitations? And then create our own, decision on what is the calculated risk that I can do in the pursuit of whatever that thing is, right? So when it came down to the house, you're right. I decided I am not going to take no. I'm willing to take calculated risks, right? So that I was posting on LinkedIn saying, is there anybody that's willing to help me with this piece, and asking help. And I want to say that out loud, because asking for help, and leaders struggle with this all the time, right? Leaders think that they might be viewed as being weak or not being courageous when they ask for help from their teams. I asked for help openly on LinkedIn. I posted about it because we can't do everything on our own.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that I'm weak or I'm not strong or I'm not able to do it. It's none of those things.
It means
it's
you're
okay.
resourceful. You're resourceful.
It's be resourceful.
Yeah.
Be resourceful. And so when you're dealing with courage, you have to recognize and build that support system. It's so important to do. And I think LinkedIn, again, gives us a great place where we could find that community of people who are willing to help, because people came out of the woodworks in that situation. I was getting emails, messages, text messages from people that were there, that were willing to help. It was beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. I think that's fantastic. So there we go. We have a comment from a LinkedIn user, Gareth Jones and Gary Bennett, regarding workplace investigations. So welcome to the program here. So Sejal, I think that's a great mini segment on courage as well. I hope that I'm confident actually that we provided some unique perspectives for those of you that are thinking about doing something, but you haven't quite built the courage up to do that. Replay this conversation, because there's some big nuggets in here that Sejal just gave us, and she's evidenced in her own life and career that this has worked. I endorse it as well. I've been through a lot, and I can tell you that I've used pieces of her methods in doing it as well, and I've also added in my own perspective. So there you go. That's delivered. We can check that off, and you only got it here on the Packard Network Live. Sejal, let's get into a bit about tooling up. Let's use that. Tooling up the viewers, those watching this, for taking their leadership to the next level by learning how to manage their brain. And specifically, I'm not just talking about biases that people might be aware of, but unconscious biases as well. And it's really important to do it. This is not an HR type of thing. I've never worked in HR. I've only run businesses, large businesses. I've had some great HR people working on my teams as well. But this is not an HR initiative of unconscious bias. But Sejal, talk to us about, give us a definition, your purest definition of unconscious bias, and let's talk about maybe some few examples of what kind of unconscious bias people have, and if anybody in the human race is exempt from them.
The answer would be no. If you have a brain, you have bias, right? So look, I think when I was litigating these cases, I was working with a lot of leaders, and as I mentioned before, I was dealing with harassment, discrimination cases, and this is where this topic really kind of got my attention. In that, when I was working with some of these leaders, I'm like, these people are actually trying to do their best, but they have a lot of biases, because we all do, because of the way that we're raised. And without realizing it, they were saying and doing things that were offensive or harming other people. And then nobody ever confronted these supervisors or leaders on their behavior. So it continued. So it looked like intentional discrimination, right? And so I realized that for me to be a good attorney, I had to become neutral. I had to figure out my own strategies so that I don't let my biases impact my work, and started creating some of the strategies that I talk about in my first TEDx talk, The Pain, the Power, and Paradox of Bias. But to answer your question, what is unconscious or implicit bias, right? It's, again, if you have a brain, you have these biases. It's where you have these implicit attitudes or stereotypes that we all formulate based on our own lived experiences, based on our beliefs, our cultures that we're raised in, the religions, our upbringings. Some of these biases could be explicit, right? Like your overt discrimination or prejudice types of biases, which I think most people think about when we talk about bias. They think of those overt biases,
Yep.
but then there's those implicit ones that happen in the blink of an eye, and they're unconscious stereotypes that lead to these microaggression type of behaviors. And so they show up in our daily lives all the time when we're making decisions, when we're, deciding whether we're going to interact with somebody. And it's usually about certain groups of people or situations that now are going to impact how we treat somebody without even realizing that we're treating them differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you could see how this is going to have a significant impact on organizational cultures and can
Right.
really limit our diversity inclusion efforts if we don't help people understand how to recognize them. And the good news is that there are, again, strategies that you can use. I talk about, I created a HAT acronym in my first TEDx talks to give people some just really quick strategies to help them mitigate their bias.
Right. Absolutely. And what I want those of you watching and listening to our conversation here to know about unconscious bias, that it is at the very root of how you build a healthy ecosystem. That's my um, definition and the placement of why this is so important. This is not a DEI initiative as I view it. And now there's a big part of the world that views it as a DEI initiative, and that's fine. Maybe their way is better than my way, but my way, which I'm sharing today on my program, is what I've seen work really well in transforming toxic ecosystems into flourishing ecosystems. If you put unconscious bias at the root of it, it addresses so many things, because if you become aware of something that normally you're not aware of because it's beneath the surface, then you can better manage it. Okay. And as a result of that, if you can weave that into the fabric of your suit, okay, and the people of the organization and the way that you do business, the way that you make processes, the way that you make changes, the way that you hire people, the way that you dismiss people. There's a way to dismiss people with respect, by the way. Okay. That's not commonly practiced even today in 2023. Okay. You can, if you are in a situation where you have to dismiss somebody, you can help them um, find something so they can continue to provide for their family. That's an example of what I'm talking about. But you've got to be aware of these unconscious, what's going on in the unconscious, in order to consciously manage it. And Sejal, maybe you could, we're getting a little low on time, but maybe you can kind of get into what people can do as a first step to really get in. And I'd like for them to know from you what are a couple things they could do to get in tune with their unconscious biases and improve it.
Absolutely. And look, let's just get the why out there first, right? Because I think
Yeah.
people don't realize why is it important to uncover these unconscious biases, right? As
Yep.
Brett was saying, it leads to better business outcomes. It leads to increased innovation, better decision making, and higher employee engagement, right? So all organizations, regardless of size or where they're located, really needs to include unconscious bias conversations, training, coaching, into their hiring, their recruitment, their promotion, their
Mhm.
performance evaluations. Because if you don't do that, you can't foster a culture of inclusion or belonging. You just can't, right? So this is where it's the good news here is that we all have them. So it's not about pointing fingers. It's not about shaming anybody or blaming anybody. It's to recognize and acknowledge that we all have them, and that there's almost the scientists is. And here's the thing: a lot of in the last decade, a lot has come out. So they've identified 180 different types of cognitive biases that exist. Right. So if somebody were to raise their hand and say, "I don't have any," I'm going to say, "Which one?" Right now, go through the 179 of the other
Let's
ones.
talk about that.
Yeah. So there are tools that can help you,
Mhm.
right, to identify some
Right.
of these biases. So the
Mhm.
implicit association test, which is an online tool, you just type in
Mhm.
Project Implicit into Dr. Google and it'll pull it up for you. It's broken out into different categories, and it just gives you some information about your natural tendencies, which we all have. And that's just valuable information, right, for you to have to say, okay, well, in certain situations, I tend to lean in this way. So when I'm making an important decision, like, am I going to hire Brett Packard to lead our organization? I can say, well, in certain situations, he's wearing that blue, striped tie, and I've got some kind of bias against the color blue. Wait a second,
Mhm.
let me check that at the door, and let me really
Right.
make sure I have objective facts or information that reflects his skills, his ability, his years and years of experience that he's going to be bringing to our organization, and not the color of his tie, right? So it's
Yep.
valuable information. So the one tool is free. It's got lots of different sections. You could do it behind closed doors and use that information so that you don't unconsciously, write someone off before giving them a fair chance. The other
Right.
second tool is, look, it's about self-reflection. When you find yourself in situations when you're dealing with a person or a thing or a situation, and you notice, I'm having an extremely, and it could be positive or negative, right? It could be either one,
Mm.
because biases could be positive or negative. But you haven't met this person, let's say, for example, and during the first time you're meeting them, you notice that you have an extremely positive reaction towards them. Ask yourself why. Why am I don't even know anything about this person. Why do I have this natural, favorable tendency towards this person? Or vice
Mhm.
versa, the negative. And so self-reflection is really the first step in overcoming biases, right? Because that's when you are
It
honest with
is.
yourself
Yep.
about where your attitudes and beliefs are coming from and examining your own
Absolutely.
experiences, right?
That's a great point. And I'd like to just kind of add on a couple of points here. So one is, if you're a leader in an organization, the way to take that HR manual and put arms and legs on it, okay? Because otherwise it's just a binder with a bunch of paper in it, right? Which by the way, I know that's where it just stays there in most cases, which is why there's so many problems today. Throw the binder away like Tom Cruise did in the Top Gun Maverick movie, right? Throw it away, okay? And start with a blank sheet of paper. Couple of tools Sejal just mentioned here, starting with self-reflection, and there's also some online tools. And sit there and learn about, be resourceful, learn about your unconscious bias, because once you're able to learn about it, then you can be more mindful about how you make decisions. Let me give you an example here. So, one of the common problems in companies today, in most places around the world, is that you have leaders that hire people just like them. And so, as a result, when bad news happens, which often happens in the world, and I'm talking about profits now, bad news happens, it's going to impact your profits. Like with Amazon yesterday, their cloud division, they've got some significant revenue weakness and they're cutting tens of thousands of jobs as a result of that. Okay. So there's some storm clouds there. Okay. Sometimes people are afraid. I'm not saying that Amazon did this, but there's bad news that always happens. Sometimes if you hire people just like you, unconsciously because of your unconscious biases. They're going to tell you what you want to hear, or they're going to think just like you. Whereas if you can become aware of your unconscious biases, you can then manage them. And then what you can do is you can then say, okay, well, maybe I need to talk to some people that wear a blue tie, even though that's not my favorite color. Then you're going to find that you're going to have a more diverse circle around you, diverse thinking, diverse cultures, diverse experiences, all people like Sejal, people like Brett, people that have been in different places of the world, different situations, challenging, riding up and down waves, all of this, that's going to enable for better decision making. And you'll also have a non punitive culture because ultimately everybody in an organization is responsible for the culture. But if you don't hire the right people because of your unconscious biases, you're not ever going to have that culture as much as you aspire. It's going to sit in that HR manual and say, oh, that's DEI. And then why in the world do you think that I'll just throw out Australia here as an example. I follow what's going on in that market. I've worked in that market. They're all, the media is all over the fact that the women in executive leadership, in board chairs, it's just not making much progress, right? There's a bit of progress, a little bit of progress, but it's at a turtle's pace, okay? And then there's other parts of the world, South Korea, for example, Japan. It's dismal what's going on out there. You want a way to change it, you change it. You want a way to improve diversity and all of this. I'm saying this should not be the objective. The objective should be to learn about unconscious biases and these other things that we're talking about, DEI, all this other stuff. The numbers will be there. It will resolve itself. Any comments on that, Sejal?
No, you just said it all. I really appreciate everything you're saying. Seeking out diverse perspectives, practicing empathy, and being open minded. You know, I'm doing
Yeah.
a lot of work on empathy workshops right now with a good friend of mine, Ajit Dodani. He's got a company called Empathify You, where he's bringing empathy into organizations. I've been working with him and his clients, and you know, it's all about, like you said, Brett, learning how to
Mhm.
what you know what our biases are, being more mindful, questioning our assumptions, challenging our limiting beliefs, and growing by learning new information and surrounding ourselves with new people. This was so great. Thank you again for
Yeah,
inviting me to
you
be
bet,
on
you
your
bet.
show.
And yeah, you bet. Thank you, Sejal. And I think, the one message I want people to walk away from here is that you can follow Sejal. You can learn all about unconscious bias. Her company, TrainXtra, she trains firms on how to do that. We didn't get much into Nobody Studios today, but we will at another time as well. But check them out. You can contact Sejal, say, hey, I want to learn more about Nobody Studios. They're creating companies from scratch, and they're doing 100 of them in 5 years, and they've already got some built up. So this is exceptional work. These companies are inclusive. That's at the foundation of what they do as well. But the message I want everybody to walk away with regarding your unconscious bias is DEI numbers and all of these things that you hear about and the frustration and media attacks and all of this stuff, um, those are lagging indicators, not leading indicators. If you really want to fix them, okay, that should not be the objective. The objective should be to learn and to manage unconscious bias and to throughout your leaders, starting with your leadership teams, and then even down into the employees, to look because they have to work together, collaboratively speaking, to learn what it is, how to manage it so that you don't exclude people with blue ties, for example. Um, and because it will change the DNA of how you do business. And you'll have the type of, getting back to the fish analogy, the type of fish tank that will be able to host both freshwater fish and saltwater fish in the same tank. It's possible to be done. And this is the kind of thing, this conversation, Sejal, you and I've had for the past hour is what I want. I want leaders to start thinking about this stuff instead of the stuff about how to grow double digit profits, revenue line, expense line, because these numbers, they will take care of themselves if you get the ecosystem right. Then you won't have to worry about that. And world class companies, this is how they do it. And then if a recession comes, you get hit by COVID lockdowns. Why did some companies continue to do well? Because they had the right culture. They had the right DNA mix as well. So think about these things because they're very important. Sejal, we're over time. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the great wisdom that you shared, and I have nothing but the highest respect for the meaningful, impactful work that you do, driven by the personal journey you've been on. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. I'm happy to come back anytime you'd like. Thank you so much. I respect you as well, and I hope that your leader, the listeners and people that are watching this, got a lot out of this conversation. Again, I'm on LinkedIn. Follow me. I go out of my way to find information, valuable information, helpful information on these topics because it's not only a life mission, right? This is the legacy that I want to leave. So I want to empower people with this information. Thank you again,
Fantastic
Brett.
as well. You're welcome. And everybody, please stay tuned because the next the Packard Network live stream we're going to be moving the cameras over to Western Africa and the great country of Nigeria. So stay tuned for details further on that. But I'll have an amazing person from Nigeria on there. She's an incredible woman, and we're going to give you some gems that you can take away, similar to what Sejal and I have done today. So with that, I wish everybody a terrific, safe, and fruitful weekend. Make some great memories with your family to tell everybody about on Monday. Thanks so much.